Last lesson in the French Revolution, we talked about the war with the First Coalition, how Spain and Austria and Prussia ganged up to try to stop the French. But the French were victorious and won the war against the First Coalition. Let's continue on the next lesson of the French Revolution. Meanwhile, in August 1792, the Paris Commune, the body governing the city of Paris, led an angry mob, which had been controlled since Lafayette and the National Guard had fired on them the previous year, and attacked the royal family in the Tuileries prison, killed all the king's Swiss guards, and forced Louise to seek refuge in the Legislative Assembly. He was taken prisoner, however, and the assembly voted to depose him. King Louis XVI and his queen, Marie Antoinette, would never rule or see each other again. The Legislative Assembly called for a new election to the National Convention to draft another new constitution for the French Republic. The National Convention was the new legislative body that replaced the National Assembly. The first act of this new government was to officially remove the king from the French government. France was declared a republic. The National Convention also discarded the traditional Gregorian calendar in favor of a revolutionary calendar. The year 1792 was labeled Year 1. Two main factions dominated the National Convention. Jacobin clubs were radical political groups that had sprung up through France during the Revolution. Initially, the Jacobins had total control of the National Convention. A split soon developed, however, between the Jacobins and the Girondins, who represented the provinces. The Girondins were soon expelled from the Jacobins because they were too moderate. The most radical Jacobins were called the Mountain because they sat in the highest seats of the hall where the National Convention met. All three groups agreed that Louis had committed treason, but only the Mountain demanded his execution. One of the most prominent Jacobin leaders was Jean-Paul Marat, who had been an early advocate of abolishing the monarchy. He advocated the elimination of any of the enemies of the revolution and thus supported the September 9, 1792 massacres, in which 1,200 political prisoners in the jails of Paris were killed by Jacobin-supported mobs. One of the most radical members of the National Convention, Marat strongly condemned the Girondins for being too moderate. The Girondins, in turn, saw him as an increasingly dangerous demagogue. On July 13th, 1793, Marat was stabbed to death in his bathtub by Charlotte Corday, a young Girondin. Another important Jacobin leader was Georges Danton, a member of the Commune of Paris, who had helped organize the attack on the Tuileries jail and the overthrow of the monarchy. In the new republic, he became Minister of Justice. A member of the National Convention, Danton dominated the first Committee of Public Safety. Robespierre. It was a country lawyer named Maximilien Robespierre who would come to symbolize much of the fanaticism of the French Revolution. First as a member of the National Convention and then as the head of the infamous Committee of Public Safety, he sought to have all the ideals of the Revolution enforced and, in doing so, perverted the ideals so many had struggled to attain. In his own words, quote, to establish and consolidate democracy, to achieve the peaceful rule of constitutional laws, we must finish the war of liberty against tyranny. We must annihilate the enemies of the Republic at home and abroad, or else we perish. So you can see this Robespierre is a really radical fellow. The guillotine. In October 1789, Dr. Joseph Guillotine proposed to the National Assembly that those condemned to death should be beheaded rather than hung, burned, or drawn and quartered. He argued that beheading was not only a quicker and more humane way to die, but that adopting a uniform method of execution would also be more democratic. In 1791, the Assembly consented and made the guillotine the official method of execution for France. It would soon become a prominent symbol of the French Revolution. The guillotine was first used in 1792. The crowd that had gathered to watch the new machine in action disliked it because death occurred too quickly. They preferred the gallows instead. During the course of the Revolution, thousands died by guillotine. At the height of its use in the city of Paris, over 1,200 people were executed during a 13-month period. That's from May 1793 to June 1794. The Mountain convinced the National Convention to charge Louis XVI with treason for conspiring with Austria and Prussia against France. Remember, the Mountain were the most radical of the Jacobins. He was found guilty and sentenced to death, and he was guillotined. Yes, they cut the head off of the king. That's regicide. After the execution of the king, the National Convention declared war on Britain and Holland, who had joined the first coalition against France. Spain later joined the coalition as well. Meanwhile, in the spring of 1793, a pro-monarchy revolt broke out in the region of La Vendée, in the French countryside. In order to deal with the crisis, the National Convention created a Committee of Public Safety, which was given broad powers in order to seize the uprising. Initially headed by Danton, the committee ended up ruling with almost dictatorial power for about a year. This development ultimately proved fatal for the revolution. The duties of the Committee of Public Safety seemed mundane enough at first. The committee was charged with the task of drafting conscripts into the French army via the levée en masse. The committee soon went beyond this, however, and rapidly expanded its authority in order to safeguard the revolution. Its leading members were Danton, Marat, and Robespierre. Initially, Danton dominated the committee. However, he began to advocate more conciliatory policies, and by the summer of 1793, he had been replaced by Robespierre, who was the more radical Jacobin. Robespierre would transform the committee into an instrument by which he could rid himself of rivals and enemies. He used the power of the committee to more or less seize control of the National Convention, which he then induced to give the committee even more power. By this point, the committee was essentially a dictatorship under Robespierre. Robespierre starts the Reign of Terror. Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety held power from July 1793 to July 1794, a period that has become known as the Reign of Terror. This period included a series of purges that took place in which nearly 40,000 people Robespierre had labeled as enemies of the revolution went to the guillotine. He cut their heads off. The Reign of Terror spared no one. Nobles, clergy, and members of the Third Estate all were killed. Among the famous figures executed during this period were Danton, the former head of the committee. Members of the National Convention who opposed Robespierre were murdered too, and Queen Marie Antoinette was also beheaded by the guillotine under Robespierre's Reign of Terror. Finally, in July 1794, some members of the National Convention, fearing their own safety, had Robespierre and his followers arrested and sent to the guillotine. The Reign of Terror had ended. These are a couple discussion questions you'll find on Google Forum for today's lesson on the Reign of Terror in the French Revolution.